Good evening, fellow Gothamites and all the ships at sea. It was a Saturday night in February of 2008 that I started drawing Outworlder. I'm in this tiny studio with my Pomeranian puppy Rachel, and we're watching the classic Fleischer Superman cartoons. And back then, Rachel was only 2¼ pounds. I mean, she was literally this big. And this was her first night in my house, and I'm celebrating because I have this terrific puppy. And we'd already killed the pizza, and we're watching the Superman cartoons, and I'm explaining it all to her. And I had a sudden ability for patience when little Rachel came along. So I started drawing the opening credits for Outworlder. And every now and then she'd look at me and smile. Pomeranians have the cutest little smiles. And so it took me 5 years to draw Outworlder. And I'm one of those people who spend damn near as much time at work as I do at home, and sometimes even more. See, for the last 19 years, I've been working double shifts through the night at Federal Express. And there are those times between shifts or waiting for late jets or trucks when I actually find some time to draw. And sometimes people would see me drawing and wonder what it was all about, what I was doing this for. And they'd often ask what the characters were doing, and were kind of perplexed about when I explained to them how much of each character's backstory was cut out so that Outworlder would pace faster and not drag. You might remember that Outworlder was originally 280 plus pages long. In fact, the Coldbringer only broke out and raised hell in Tabal in the last 2.5 hours of the movie. Everything else was just leading up to that. There was the miners tunneling too far and coming up in the watery subways of Manhattan. In the city, they found artifacts that they brought down to Tabal, including a frozen head that would later become Monarch. And with the revelation of a lost city above, well, you can imagine that would cause turmoil in a place like Tabal, where they were raised living a lie. You have to keep in mind, for centuries, people in Tabal were told they live in the core of an asteroid. Yeah, just out there in trackless space. But to find out they were living under the surface of a breathable planet caused a schism in Tabal. Those few that knew wanted to return to Manhattan and live up there, breathing clean air, drinking clean water, and eating natural food. Not down underneath the ground, eating paste, compounds, or each other, because, hey, meat's got to come from somewhere. That was the developing a divided city-state, and there were those subverting the government that were just not having it. This was when the elected council went into turmoil, deciding what to tell people and what maybe they shouldn't. And as you learned, the council, once the council was going into chaos, Mach, Monarch, Cruella, and others like them puppeted the Cybernauts to kill the council and retake the city. At this time, General Narcius was among the deposed, so he either was going to be forced out of the city or he was going to be killed on sight. Now, there's a lot to think through, so we're just going to touch on a few of the characters and get some idea where they came from and what inspired them and what their character arcs were, what they were intended to be. Now, what you're seeing essentially is an origin story. You are seeing how Captain Hauser is mutated by Project Coldbringer into a living energy weapon. So we begin with Captain William Conrad Hauser. He is a 28-year-old Marine Corps aviator attached to Squadron Zero. He flies what is called an H-Pack. This is an acronym for a human-piloted alien craft. Yes, he is literally flying an alien-made fighter craft. Now, we don't know what species built it or how the pilots in Squadron Zero learned to fly them. I mean, when you think about it, how do the members of the aggressor squadron learn to fly MiGs without nosing those things into the tarmac? You're talking about some serious reverse engineering here to learn how to fly, service, and communicate with an alien fighter craft. And he cannot tell his wife or his daughter or his parents about anything that he does. He is literally in a silent service fighting a secret war. He goes from fighter base to aircraft carrier to places unknown, and if he's lucky he can phone his family once or twice a month for perhaps a few minutes. So you can imagine Captain Hauser feels like he's neglecting his family because he cannot be there for them. Now, what's fortunate for him is that his wife Janine has a terrific career as an actress on stage, a stage writer and producer. In fact, if you looked at the background in the living room scene toward the end of Outworlder, you'll note that there's a poster on the wall that is, it's in very small print, says a Janine Hauser production. That's right next to the posters of Superman the movie and Star Trek the motion picture. Now Janine is raising Sandra almost entirely by herself. What you figure is that back in the 1970s, William Hauser met Janine in college while he was a ROTC midshipman. He would have been majoring in engineering, whereas she was in the dramatic arts. So the two of them were opposites in many ways, just to begin with. And later on in life, he's going to be traveling the world prosecuting the mission, whereas she's going to waste no time setting down roots in Manhattan, where they're both from, and she'll be getting into the theater community. So theirs was always going to be a long-distance relationship, and they knew that going in. Janine was never going to be a military wife who follows her husband all over the globe living in GI-dependent housing. She cannot create or thrive in an environment like that. And she doesn't want to raise Sandra that way either. And William knows he cannot take his family to the many places that he's going. So the two of them know they must structure their lives differently from even how other military couples do it. And all the while, Captain Hauser is covertly fighting the Nitruscans, who are sending these ships back in time to the 20th century to harvest what they want. And with him is his Lieutenant Mitchell, his wingman. Now, whereas Captain Hauser is a rather stoic, almost humorless ramrod of a man, Mitchell is different depending on whom he encounters. Mitchell enjoys his military service, but his having to keep secrets from his wife has made him terribly distant from her. And you can imagine that Hauser and Mitchell must talk about how to handle their families and their covert obligations over dinner at the Area 51 mess hall. What we see halfway through the Outworlder is that Hauser and Mitchell chase an Etruscan shadow fighter toward the moon. The shadow fighter scrambles its warp engine and drags Hauser and Mitchell through time to the 28th century Tabal. Once there, the H-Packs are tumbling out of control. As you saw, Mitchell manages to punch out of his fighter, but Hauser crashes in his. Then we jump cut to the Galvo Biological Weapons Lab, where Mach launches the Coalbringer from the mutation vault. You're going to have to wait till the end of Outworlder 2 to learn why Captain Hauser took the exact form that he did. And you might also remember that before he was launched, his mind was chemically altered and his memories submerged, and he had received program which was borderline psychosis. His memory of the last 28 years is practically deleted. And what the audience is left to wonder is what brought the Coalbringer back to some level of consciousness and caused him to go in search of his past memories and his future purposes. After feeding at the fission reactor, Coalbringer wastes no time crippling military bases, cutting communications, and severing the supply lines to said military bases. And then he hits Drakauer concentration camp. Now notice the gates at Drakauer with the curved edge, heading in. They somewhat resemble the same type of gates that were at Auschwitz or Dachau, except that how I depicted them in Drakau, where they have laser webbing in place of the electrified barbed wire. We learned that it was here that Captain Hauser spent some time at the Drakauer Experimental Zoo with the prisoners who'd wanted to leave Tabal. These were people that Mach used as test subjects for Project Coalbringer. and the ones that were not successful either died or were left to be studied until obsolescence. So by the time the Coldbringer returns, these people are too far gone. They will not survive, and they do not want to. Small wonder they beg him to euthanize them all. And when he does, not only does he intake their energy, but so many of their memories as well. So now he knows his way up to Manhattan, and he also has some idea of whom else he could find up there. What we learned at the New York Public Library is that it is a place from Captain Hauser's youth. Both he and General Narcissus are here to learn what they can from the environment and each other. This is a moment that will happen in future Outworlder stories where the officers confer. Here we learn the gravity of the problem and just how bad it's going to get later. In this case, we want to find out what is on the other side of that mountain of debris. Hey, while you're panning around that debris, see if you can find the tag of a notable street gang from a movie in 1979. I bet you can find it. I bet you find the other piece of debris. I think there was also from there was a bit of graffiti from a movie in 1986. I'll give you a hint. Mack truck standing in front of it. Okay, so originally Coldbringer went on a much longer walk through Manhattan. He saw the remains of Midtown Comics where he used to shop for his books. He went to the Hell's Kitchen apartment where he grew up. He saw the shadow patterns of his wife and daughter on the wall of their off-Broadway condominium. He saw his old school, the gym where he learned to box, even the rusted remains of his black 1982 Trans Am in a cramped garage. But while that does show more about where the character comes from, it unfortunately bogs the story down too much. You can depict scenes like that in a prose novel, but you have to economize in comics, television, or film. True, you can tell almost any genre story in the comics medium, but if your story drags, the viewer is just going to shut it off, and they're going to open up a recent issue of Spider-Man. I'm telling friends, and I remember back in 88, 89, I was telling friends in Europe about the characters and how, and what was interesting was how so many of them thought that the Coldbringer was a metaphor for a nuclear bomb. I was explaining that this was an instance where the weapon had more conscience than the military scientist that created them. Mock wanted the Coldbringer to go back in time to the 20th century to defeat the militaries of every nation, slaughter their leaders, and secure the planet for occupation by the Dragos. Now, that was what General Kruller designed the Dragos for in the first place. It had the weapons, the methods of propulsion, and the ability to carry thousands of Nitruscans and Cybernauts into battle. Yet the Dragos is not the perfect weapon system by any means. It can overkill a world and then end up depriving the Nitruscans of what they came for in the first place. Ironic, huh? As too many writers, artists, and musicians will tell you, creativity can be frustrating. And it's not supposed to be easy. It really isn't. Digging a ditch, you got a shovel. That makes it easy. But creativity is not. You keep thinking for quite a time that what you've created, or written rather, is just right, that it'll work. And then you keep evolving that piece of work. You keep changing it, sometimes right up to the last minute. In fact, I was adding lines of dialogue from Mock while I was filming Outworlder. Yeah, these things just busted into my head in the month of May, and these lines just came to me, and I was thinking this picture might actually be missing something if I hadn't voiced these lines in there. They weren't in the script at all. I just put these few lines in there, and I think it helped me to explain the character a little better. Now you might say I put my own frustration, or that sense of futility and that need to overcome failure into the obsessed Dr. Mock. Here Mock had a plan to solve Tabal's problems, But the council didn't believe that burdening those in past generations was the way to go about solving their problems. The council was a moral, ethical, thinking, reasoning body, and Mach wasn't having it. So he took his artifact, this frozen head of a 20th century school teacher, and wired her brain to transmit to Mach's own cybernaut army. You have to remember, another part that got cut out of Outworlder was that the cybernauts were recycled Nitruscans. The frontal lobe of the brain is taken out, and the communications module is added in, and that allows the state or monarch rather, to manipulate each and every cybernaut, and also allow them to function, see, hear, and exist as a hive mind, communicating to one another. So from here on, this teacher becomes monarch, and she uses the cybernauts to kill the council and end democracy in Tabal. Anyone opposing the state ended up fodder for Mach, as he tried to perfect Project Coldbringer. Morality, decency, ethics, well, that all went out the portal. In Monarch's regime, they weren't having any of that. If you ever want to see how good or bad a person really is, think about it. Just give them a little power. If they play games and abuse authority, then you know you have a despot that needs to rapidly be deposed. And such is the case with Mach, who puppets Monarch to rule the city-state and implement his agenda. Or is that the other way around? Think about it. Did this deranged school teacher let Mach wire her brain with a transmitter so that she could puppet Mach's own cybernauts and run Tabal herself? Yeah. And how did she end up this way? For decades, we've seen juvenile delinquents bringing guns to school. In fact, it was my generation that stupidly raised the balance of power from knives and shanks up to guns in the 1980s. And as you know from watching your daily headlines, mayhem and murder followed. Now think what happens when a teacher decides to flip the script and brings a gun to school. And you have to try to figure out what her motivations are. Maybe she's sick of punks and she decides she won't live in fear of them. We can deduce that she might have blown away a few juvies before running out of bullets and being tackled by a cop. She was then processed, put on trial, judged guilty for multiple murders, and then a decision was made. Instead of putting her on death row, the plan was made to decapitate her and study her diseased brain. Notice how you never heard about this in the media. And you can only wonder what those criminologists learned before they put her head in the deep freeze. And then she gets found centuries later by Nitruscan miners who tunneled too far. Now, one thing I learned growing up on shows like Star Trek, Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, was that the villain never saw themselves as doing evil. No. These characters felt like they were backed up against the wall with few or no options. So they figured out what they could, implemented what resources they had, and made the most of what they could, often with devastating results. But these people think they're saving their society. They think this course of action they're on is the only way to do it, and they're not going to hear what anybody else has to say. I remember one of the races that used to fascinate me so much on the original Star Trek series was the Klingons. And for 3 seasons, they were quite the enigma. If you remember the episode Errand of Mercy, that's where we first see the Klingons. Everyone remembers John Colicos as Commander Kur. Magnificent actor. And in Errand of Mercy, we saw the Klingons being Nazi-like in their occupational tactics. And later on, you had an episode titled Private Little War. Remember, this was the comparison to Vietnam that Gene Roddenberry managed to slide past all those network censors brilliantly, might Here, the Klingons were being cast as being akin to the Russians, equipping the North Vietnamese with weapons, tactics, and logistical support. And later in the third season, we had an episode titled The Day of the Dove, where Kang's wife Mara explains that there are poor planets in the Klingon Empire struggling to survive. We learn here that the Klingons strike out against other worlds for territory and much-needed resources. So the Klingons are depicted many, many ways, but never as stereotypical stock villains. And then came the newer versions in the movies, in Next Generation, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise. This is where more dimensions were added to Klingon families, Klingon politics, Klingon rituals. And the more complex, the more interdirected these characters became, well, not only did they become seen less as villains, but they actually became more enjoyed by the fan base. So much so that many of these fans, including my brother, might I add, would tailor their own Klingon costumes, learn makeup techniques, and even learn some of the language generated by Mark Okrand. Now, as I've told you before, I'm no longer trying to write for the print, TV, or film industry. That just got too frustrating. What I'm doing nowadays is creating just for you. And I've met with some of you at comic book conventions, comic stores, theaters, and galleries. If you've been to Star Trek conventions, back when I had hair, I was dressed as Captain Kirk. As the hair fell away, I started dressing as Captain Picard. And you might have noticed nearby was a Klingon. That was my brother. If you've been to some of the comic book conventions, I oftentimes go as Batman, and my brother goes as a really, really well done Joker. He has some very well tailored suits, and he does some really interesting effects with his makeup, and he can do an interesting Joker. So I've met with some of you at these places, and from what I've seen, you are an intellect with life experiences, an educational background, and points of view all your own. And what you also realize is that if a writer does not respect the intellects of the people they should be writing for, then they shouldn't be writing. They shouldn't be writing. What I learned from Gene Roddenberry and Rod Serling was that they wrote knowing that there was a brilliant person on the other side of that TV screen. And they believed that. The thinking, feeling, reasoning being. Yes, with many talents and abilities that make them unique, that make them a population of one. Now, I know there's a stereotype that gets thrown around a lot out there, but I'll say one thing about we science fiction and comic book fans, and that is that we do not fit into molds at all. And we don't want to. No. We like IDIC. We like infinite diversity through infinite combinations. That's what Gene Roddenberry left behind for us. He also left behind a standard that a lot of we writers and artists have to live up to. And it's difficult to do. You're trying to write an intelligent piece of science fiction, but at the same time you're also having to cut so much material out so that the story does not drag and bore the viewers. So what I want to do is talk to you about what got cut out so you can fill in some of the gaps. Later on, you're innovative. You can fill in some of those other gaps yourself in fan fiction and fan films. That stuff's a lot of fun. So let's think on the character of General Narcius next. Here you have a Nitruscan man, middle-aged, who is living with enormous survivor's guilt because he could not stop the Cybernauts from killing the Council. And his entire world gets flipped upside down in mere minutes. And suddenly he's running for his life. His own soldiers were killed by the cybernauts, and there was no tactic he could use to stop it. So he remembered the reports from the miners about the city beyond Tabal. And when there was no place else to run, he went there. And keep in mind, General Narcissus has lived his entire life underneath the ground. So this man knows nothing about weather. Right? He arrives in Manhattan and it's cold. He's got to find shelter. He needs to find water. He's got to hunt animals and eat flora. And he's never done any of this kind of thing before. All the while, he's wondering if the cybernauts will come topside and go hunting for him. But for years, there is silence. He reads books, watches films, microfiches, anything he can find that is not decayed to dust. Because if nothing else, a general is a constant learner. He cannot be complacent. He must always be cutting edge. Because if he isn't, he's going to lose to someone who is. And then one night, he's sitting in the New York Public Library, not knowing that a galvo-biological weapon can hear his heartbeat, can scan his brainwaves, and smell his scent from an impressive distance. That's something else I cut out of there. That was a shame. I should have left that in there. Now, you have to remember that General Narcissus only knows Project Coldbringer from Mock's proposal 8 years before. And he didn't like it. Suddenly he's faced with this 8-foot-tall weapon that wants answers. And here is Mock realizing that this weapon can retake Tabal, that this weapon can end the oppression and help him liberate that population. From there on, it will be upon Narcissus, and whoever he can bring along with him, to make a society where logic, reason, innovation, and tolerance have their way, where they actually become the rule of the day. This is what a man like General Narcissus fights for. When you look at Inspector Matrak, what you see is a young cog in the machine. Now, she doesn't know how to question authority as yet. She's more indoctrinated than educated. And ironically, it is Dr. Mock that tells her she's being set up by Monarch. And it will be Matrak that we follow to learn more about who the Coldbringer was before he became that. It is Matrak who enters Mock's house and opens his wall safe to find those artifacts. Remember how in one hand she's holding the Project Coldbringer file disc and Hauser's Marine dog tags, and in the other hand she's holding the photograph with Captain Hauser with Janine and Sandra. And keep in mind, Matrak has never seen a human being before. She doesn't know what species these people are, where they come from, or anything else like that. But she's going to quickly put two and two together. And what she comes to understand is that the Coldbringer weapon she's tracking is a man out of another time. She's not tracking an Etruscan, she's tracking something else. And she has to wonder how much of his original self is left. 100 or so pages later, she finds out. So now, this cog has to find a new purpose in Tabal as it changes from a despotic police state to a democracy. And all of it because she broke from Monarch's orders and started thinking and reasoning for herself. Now think about what a great character arc that is. That's a character that develops nicely. I like that. I'm glad I didn't cut so much of her material out. Okay. So now it's time for a little spoiler alert. Now, she only appeared in a few pictures in the city of Frankfurt, Germany. She was hovering behind a structure on St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, watching the Coldbringer fly over the Romerplatz. And what you see, well, what you see is that she watches him like she already knows him. Yeah. And then she transmutes into Starship mode and warps out. Now, we don't know where she's from. And we don't know where she's going. And we don't know why she's there. And as you notice, she doesn't feel like telling you. But her name is Diva, and the sequel is going to be her origin story. And I'm over 60 drawings into this sequel right now. I think you're going to enjoy her as a character. In fact, I think some cosplay girls might even start dressing up like her, which is going to be fascinating. Really. What I should tell you ahead of time is that she is no simple sidekick. Far from it. Far from that. Rather, she has returned home from war, and she is having difficulties processing her memories and some unusual abilities that she cultivated during war. And these abilities keep surfacing. Now you think about that. You've got women returning home from wars all over the world, not just from Afghanistan or Iraq, but from other fronts where there might have been heated situations that didn't get as much media attention. And what you realize is that these women, just like Diva, if they don't learn to control their abilities, the results could be cataclysmic. Now, from time to time, I'm going to put pictures from Outworlder 2 onto the website so that you can see how everything is progressing. And I'm planning for completion sometime in 2016. So Gothamites, in the meantime, maintain your health and continue to live your long and productive life. Good night and good luck.